Yate Bene, or actually not Yate Bene Yate, my relatives. This is Mark Charles. It is about 4 o'clock Eastern Time, and I'm sitting down to begin my weekly book study going through Unsettling Truths, the ongoing Dehumanizing Legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery. This is our third session now, and we're going through this week chapter 2, which is the power of narratives and the imagination. And so we'll be going through this chapter, discussing a few parts of it, going in depth on a few more, and then we'll take some time at the end to answer any questions that people may have about this chapter. Before I begin, let me do as I always do by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from what's now known as Washington, D.C., and these are the traditional lands of the Piscataway. I want to honor the Piscataway as the nation, the people indigenous to these lands. I want to publicly state how humbled I am to be living on these lands, and I want to thank them for their stewardship of these lands. Let me share the URL for this stream to my Twitter account really quick, and then we'll be able to get going. This won't take very long at all. I'm getting a little quick about this as I get better at handling some of these things. Okay, so this week last week we went through chapter 1, and that was the Doctrine of Discovery and Why It Matters. And the week before that, we went through the introduction and talked about some of the importance of this book, as well as the piece I wrote about the importance of watching the sunrise. And this chapter it's a very good chapter. It's really in depth. You may have to read through it a few times to follow everything we're trying to say in this. And this is one of the chapters I'm so grateful to my co-author, Suchan Roth. He brought a lot of the research on imagination and social imagination and theological imagination. And this chapter is really a great example of Suchan's work and some of the just incredible contributions he made as my co-author in this book, and shows how this book is a true partnership between both of us. But chapter 2 is a book a chapter I have to attribute a lot of the credit for this chapter to Suchan, because a lot of the research is in this book is what he brought into this project. And so I'm very grateful to him for that. Going through this chapter, and it's about the power of narratives and the imagination. And this is actually where I would say the Doctrine of Discovery gets the most dangerous. Right? It's not that it was just this one-time written out document that said these are certain ways, are things the way things ran, but this doctrine, this worldview got deeply embedded into both the theological and the social imagination of the Western Church and a lot of Western countries. And that infected the institutions of those countries as well as the individuals, and it perpetuated itself moving forward, and it deeply embedded itself into the narrative of both the church and the nations. And so now it's this ongoing process that at points seems deeply overwhelming of how do we even begin to address it? How do we begin to work through this? And so this chapter is about kind of how it got embedded, and the ways it is embedded deep into our systems, our thinking, our imagination, our theologies, and all of these other things. So one of the points we want to look at first, and I'm just going to kind of go through this section by section. And if you have questions about this chapter, I encourage you to put them into the comment section of the wherever you're watching the live stream, whether it's on Facebook or on YouTube. They should show up on my my stream here, my panel here, and I'll search through and look for any questions that come up. Also, I may have one of my friends, Phil, I think he's going to join this stream in a little bit, and hopefully he'll be able to help me sort through so we can have some question and answer at the end of this time. But in this discussion on narratives and imagination, one of the things we look at first is the defining of social reality. And in the first page of this chapter, one of the things we look at, this is on page 24 of the book, we talk about Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman. And it says they present a theory on the construction of social reality. They argue that the social systems are formed through the interaction of multiple factors, including externalization, institutionalization, and internalization. And so just kind of briefly going over that, you'll have an individual, right, who will start a system, maybe a pastor of a church or the leader of a government or someone who starts an organization. And that individual will have certain values, they'll have certain practices that they put in place into that organization or into that institution. And over time, those things become institutionalized. And then the institution also takes on a life of its own and kind of expands and adds that and makes it the norm within that institution. And then those, in turn, once it's institutionalized, then that gets embedded back into the individuals through the process of internalization. And that becomes, oh shoot, the sound is now. This has not been a good day for technology or for planning. Let me double check something here. I'm going to actually switch to my other microphone and see if, oh, I can't do that on here. Shoot, that's on a Zoom call. Let me take a look here. Can anyone else comment if the sound is still low, or is it not very good at the moment? If it is bad, I may need to just do this again tomorrow. Okay. Thank you, Nora. I appreciate you for giving me that input. Please let me know if the sound goes bad again. I'm kind of watching the comments, and if it does go bad, I'm actually ordering a lot of new equipment this week and next, and I'm hoping to get things going again here. So we should get past some of this technological difficulties in the next week or two. Anyway, so the social system gets defined and it perpetuates through this internalization, institutionalization, and then our externalization, institutionalization, and then internalization. And one of the examples we have of what this looks like is on page 26 of this chapter. And I'm going to just read a piece of that section. And the example we gave is actually an experience I had when I was preaching at a church on our reservation. And I had gone into this church. I was I hadn't pastored yet. I was a licensed exhorter, and I was preaching in some of the local churches around the reservation. And I went to one church on our reservation, and I preached a sermon about missions. And I challenged the congregation to go be a part of bringing the gospel to the ends of the earth. I knew very well that among my congregants were boarding school survivors, were people who didn't have much education, who made jewelry or who lived much more hand to mouth. I was very aware of that, but I was still deeply challenging them that they had a role, they had a part in help bringing the gospel even to the ends of the earth. And that message came through pretty clear in my sermon. So clear, in fact, after the sermon, one of the elders, one of the older women of the church came up to me. And she said, "Thank you for that sermon. It was very inspiring." She said, "However, I can't become a missionary. I'm a boarding school survivor. I only have an elementary education. I don't have my college degree. I herded sheep. I don't have the diploma. I don't have the education necessary to become a missionary." Now, we've all, especially people who are in leadership, have heard this before, right? I don't have the qualifications. I don't have whatever. And the correct answer is, well, God doesn't look at that. God can use whoever you are wherever you are, and he can take you and you can be a part of his work. Now, that's the right answer. But if we're truly being honest, right, were this woman or most other people in the congregation that day to apply to a mission organization, to become a missionary, to bring the gospel to the ends of the earth, they would have rarely, if ever, been accepted, right? You need your college degree. You need to have a network of people that you can fundraise from. You need to show leadership and organizational skills and all these other things that you have to show that you are worthy of going out into the mission field. And we know that most people, I knew, was very aware that most people in that congregation would not be accepted as a standard missionary. And so I heard this woman's response to me, and it really humbled me, because I couldn't just give her the pat answer of, well, God can use you. Well, yes, he can. But again, the church, the world would have just used her, as we point out in this book, as some sort of a support role. Much like my grandfather, who served as a translator for some of the early missionaries from the Christian Reformed Church who came to our lands. And he would come home once a month. They would have planning strategy meetings where the missionaries would meet and the translators would be there. And the white missionaries sat at a table in the center of the room. And my grandfather, along with the other translators, sat in chairs along the walls. And they were discussing strategy, how to bring the gospel more effectively to the people on the Navajo Nation. And my grandfather would come home from these meetings so frustrated because he was not allowed to speak. He was not allowed to participate in the meetings unless he was asked a specific question. And he would come home saying, I'm never going to be a full partner. And that's absolutely true, because he was not white, because he had not earned his degree, because he was not ordained. He was never going to be treated as a full partner, even though he knew the culture and the language and the customs and probably even the gospel better than most of the missionaries who were sitting around the table. My grandfather helped translate the Bible into Navajo. The missionaries would get angry with him because they would say something for him to translate, and they would speak for maybe 1 or 2 sentences, and he would go on for several paragraphs, and they would chastise him for adding to the gospel, for not interpreting them directly. And he would say, to describe something in Navajo, you just can't say something like predestination or whatever other theological terms you're talking about and just translate it in 1 or 2 words in Navajo. You have to describe it. You have to paint a picture. And so he was so frustrated that he was never going to be treated as a true partner. And so when I heard this woman from the church tell me that she was inspired by my message, but was very aware she would never be accepted to be a missionary, I was deeply humbled. Now, I wasn't ordained at that point either. I had, and I'm not ordained now, but I was not ordained, and I had graduated from college at UCLA. I had my degree in history. I was a lay pastor or preacher within the Christian Reformed Church, a licensed exhorter is what they called me. I didn't have the right to preach. I only could have the right to exhort, whatever the difference that is. But I heard her, and I was, thinking, well, maybe I should get ordained at some point. Maybe I should go on to get more education so I can do this work even more effectively. And yet when she came to me and she said, I can't follow you. I can't model my life after you because I'm an older lady and I will never get my college degree. I probably will never even get my high school degree. I will never get ordained, and I have no chance of ever becoming a missionary. And I realized that the more degrees, the one I already had and any more I might receive in the future, would really only work to separate me from the people I felt most called to minister to, which was my own people on our reservation. And I left that service and I was deeply pondering this, and I thought about this for several weeks. And I came to the conclusion. I said to myself, I'm not done learning. I'm not done educating myself. I'm not done engaging intellectually in these issues. But I'm done keeping score. I have my high school diploma. I have my bachelor's degree from UCLA. But I'm not going to get any more degrees. Not because degrees are bad, not because they're not useful, but because every degree I add onto my resume, onto my every group of letters I add after my name, will only further separate me from the people I feel most called to minister to. So I said, I'm not done learning. I'm not done reading. I'm not done educating myself. I'm not done engaging in dialogue, but I'm done keeping score. I'm done getting more degrees. Because I wanted to be able to stand in front of people with the greatest amount of integrity I could muster and be able to look them in the eye and say, you don't need a degree. If I have 5 degrees and they have none, and I say, God doesn't need your degrees, but but I have 5, I don't have much integrity to say those words. Now, having a degree opens up other tables and other conversations for you to be in. And again, I'm not saying degrees are bad, but I made the decision there that I was not going to get any more degrees. And so since then, whether it's in introductions, I've been introduced as Dr. Mark Charles, I've been introduced as all these other titles, and when it's appropriate and when I'm able to do it, I correct people. I'm not a doctor, I'm not ordained, I'm not a reverend, I'm not a minister. I'm just Mark Charles. And I do that because, again, my audience, the primary group of people I want to have influence with, the people who I want to have the most integrity in their eyes, is not the white landowning men sitting at the top of corporations and institutions, but of my own people, weaving rugs, herding sheep, and living on our reservations. And this is the challenge with this social reality, with this process of externalization, institutionalization, and internalization, is it becomes this self-perpetuating process that is almost impossible to break out of. It's almost impossible to put an end to it. Again, I could have said to that lady, well, God doesn't need your degree, but I already had my own. And so my words would carry very little weight. And so I decided I need to model something different in an effort to step out of this self-perpetuating process. Again, not that degrees are bad. I've actually done research about how we can better prepare Native students to go out of reservations into Western universities and be more successful. I'm not saying degrees are bad, but I'm saying I've made this commitment to step out of that process. But it's that process, especially of institutionalization, that makes this overwhelming, because it becomes so ingrained, so embedded in the social systems. The next section is titled The Power of the Imagination. And we look at social imagination and theological imagination and even transcendent imagination. And social imagination is defined as it's what defines reality and what is possible. Theological imagination expands beyond the limits of the immediate reality. Willie Jennings wrote that theological has the imaginative capacity to redefine the social. And that can create a transcendent imagination, something that even goes beyond the realm of what's possible in the human world. And if we look at kind of what these examples are of these artists, I was thinking about this. These aren't ones we included in the book, but examples of this might be the social imagination is this imagination that we can discover lands that are already inhabited, right? It's this, Columbus discovered America. We start the book out with this understanding of you cannot discover lands already inhabited. We're trying to address the social imagination of this nation that says they discovered North America. The theological imagination, it interjects theology, it interjects the divine into that social imagination, and it expands it even further. So the notion of manifest destiny, right? This understanding of we have promised lands. God has favored us and we live here. This is an example, I think, of a theological imagination, a disease, coming out of a disease social imagination, that of discovery, And then this diseased theological imagination gets born, this understanding of manifest destiny, that white Europeans have God's permission, God's blessing to rule these lands from sea to shining sea. And then that creates this transcendent imagination, which I would identify is the myth of American exceptionalism, right? This belief that white Christian European Americans have this unique relationship with the God of Abraham. Not only do they have a land covenant, which gives them the right to commit genocide, but they are exceptional in every way, morally, culturally, linguistically, in their social systems, in their governance. All of these ways they claim that they are exceptional over and above everybody else, religiously. And it just becomes embedded in every aspect of society. We identify this on page 9 with this story about Franklin Graham, who after a terrorist attack in Europe, he writes that the threat of Islam is real. The threat of Islam is serious. The threat of Islam is dangerous. We need to pray that God will give our president and our Congress and our Senate wisdom and the guts to do what is right for our nation. We note in this book that he doesn't seek for God to help those who are hurt. He doesn't pray for the church to love those who are its enemies, but he prays for the political leaders that they will have the guts to enact violence against the people who were behind this terrorist attack. That was his prayer. And this, as we lay out in this book, this displays tremendous amount of moral and religious superiority that's deeply embedded with this diseased social imagination, this diseased theological imagination, this diseased transcendent imagination. It gets even worse, right? It's not only Lindsey Graham or Franklin Graham that does this, but it gets even worse when there's another image I want to show you. I show this in my lectures, which is this quote by Clay Higgins, who is the congressman. He was a congress member from Louisiana's 3rd district. And after another terrorist attack in London, he wrote this on his public Facebook page: "The free world, all of Christendom, is at war with Islamic horror. Not one penny of American treasure should be granted to any nation who harbors these heathen animals. Not a single radicalized Islamic suspect should be granted any measure of quarter. Their intended entry into America homeland should be summarily denied. Every conceivable measure should be engaged to hunt them down, hunt them, identify them, and kill them all for the sake of all that's good and right. Just kill them all." Congressman Clay Higgins, Louisiana's 3rd district. This was on June 4th, 2017. And Franklin and Facebook did not even take this down immediately as hate speech. Right? This is how this diseased, this corrupt social theological imaginations is so deeply embedded in our society that our leaders can talk this way and not even get called out for it, not even get rebuked for it. Right? This is how deeply systemic these problems are within our nation. We then go into a chapter or a section on metaphors. And let me bring up my notes on metaphors here. When we talk about metaphors, the 2 examples we give are the metaphors used by Jesus in the parables to define God and his overwhelming love. We also note that Satan, or the enemy, will use fearful metaphors to try and drive people to certain actions, and he tempts Jesus, and he says he'll come back at a more opportune time when Jesus is already going to be struggling with fear, which happens in the garden at the end of his ministry. And then we compare that to what Christendom does, the heresy of Christian empire. And we look specifically at Donald Trump and his use of fear to win Christian votes. And the quote that we use is on page 32 by Donald Trump. And he was actually on what's known as the Brody file. And he was on CBN News. This is October 27, 2016. He was being asked about the evangelical vote. And he said, we're doing very well with evangelicals. And if they vote, we're going to win the election. And we're going to have a great Supreme Court. We're going to have religious liberty, because religious liberty, let's face it, I saw a high school football coach the other day. They were praying before the game. You know, they're going into combat. They're in the locker room praying. And I think they're going to fire him. You know, they've suspended him. I think they want to fire him. Who ever heard of a thing like this? And I always say to you, we're all going to be saying Merry Christmas again. But the truth is, religious liberty is under tremendous stress. Now, I remember when Donald Trump, the first time I saw this quote in 2016 during the campaign. And I was really intrigued by what Donald Trump said, because, right, he's laying out his campaign strategy for white evangelicals based entirely on fear. And so I researched, especially this football coach. And I found that, yes, there was a football coach. I forget where he was coaching at. But there was a football coach who, after games, was going into the center of the field and praying. And soon some of his players began to join him. And soon the entire team was joining him. And I think even at times the opposing team joined him. Now, he was the coach at a public school. And the public school system came to this coach and said, you cannot pray after games like this, because you are a leader for these students. And there may be students who feel compelled to join your prayer, not because they believe in the prayer, but because they don't want to miss out on this team event, or they don't want to fall out of good graces with their coach. And so they told the coach, you're welcome to pray in the privacy of your own home, but you may not pray in public like this. And I remember watching an interview by this coach, and he decided to fight this. And in explaining what his thinking behind this, he said, you know, I'm a Christian who wears his faith on his sleeves, on his sleeve. I'm not someone who's going to go into the closet and pray. Now, that quote really intrigued me, right? Because when you look at the teachings of Jesus, well, a few things come up. First of all, Donald Trump is using this religious liberty and this fear of persecution. And the response to that is, Donald and any other evangelicals, especially white evangelicals, if you're in fear of persecution, if you're looking for God to save you from persecution, you're in the wrong religion, right? This is not what Jesus promised. In fact, he was pretty clear. We can just look, this is just one example of Luke 21, verses 12 through 18, where Jesus told his disciples, but before all of this, they will seize you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and put you in prison. You will be brought before kings and governors, all on account of my name. And so you will bear testimony to me, but make up your minds not to worry beforehand how you will defend yourselves. For I will give you words and wisdom that none of your adversaries will be able to resist or contradict. You will be betrayed even by parents, brothers and sisters, relatives and friends. They'll put some of you to death. Everyone will hate you because of me. This is what Jesus said to his disciples. So if you became a Christian thinking God was going to protect you from persecution, you're in the wrong religion. You are absolutely in the wrong religion. Jesus made no promise about that whatsoever. And so the fact that Donald Trump uses fear of persecution as a way to get Christians to vote for him, saying he will protect them from this onslaught of religious persecution, he is contradicting what Jesus taught and what Jesus promised was going to happen to his own followers. But second, going on to this section on prayer, right? Because this is where it gets really interesting. If we read about prayer, and again, the coach said that he was not a Christian. He was a Christian who wore his faith on his sleeve. He was not a Christian who was going to go into the closet and pray. Well, in Matthew 6, Jesus is teaching his disciples how to pray. And he says, when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your room, close your door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. What astounded me by this is Donald Trump was campaigning to white evangelicals. By saying he was going to protect them from something Jesus promised was going to happen to them. And B, he was encouraging them to pray piously in the middle of filled stadiums in a way that guarantees God would not hear their prayer in the first place. Right? This is how this diseased social imagination and this diseased theological imagination and this diseased transcendent imagination was so deeply embedded into our nation's psyche that we elected a president who was elected in mass part because of the vote by white evangelicals, who was openly contradicting the teachings of Jesus and the values that he was describing. This is how deeply embedded these things are. We then have a section on the power of narratives. And in the power of narratives, we talk about how narratives have the tendency to outlive the individuals. It's part of the institutionalization, but even more than that, it's just a part of the background story that's running behind it. And so oftentimes when you try to address these unjust systems as either an individual problem or even as simply an institutional problem, and you don't address it at the narrative level, how it's gotten into the psyche, the emotions, the imagination of society and of the theology, that's what allows the narrative to continue. And the example we give is the narrative of white supremacy, right? Which manifested itself at the start of our nation in many ways, one of which was the act of chattel slavery, the buying and selling of Black people as property. When that system was deconstructed, not abolished, but it was redefined and codified by Abraham Lincoln. He didn't abolish slavery. He redefined and codified it under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. So slavery still existed. It was just no longer chattel slavery, but it still existed. And what that did is it allowed the narrative of white supremacy to continue. See, as we point out in my lectures, as in other parts of the book on Lincoln, in chapters 9 and 10, Lincoln was a blatant white supremacist, right? A blatant white supremacist. He was trying to distinguish the difference in the Lincoln-Douglas debates between him and Judge Douglas. And he was trying to highlight the similarities. They both believed in the myth, the lie of white supremacy. They disagreed on the institution of chattel slavery. Abraham Lincoln, or Judge Douglas, let me start with him. Judge Douglas felt that we needed chattel slavery to keep this lie of white supremacy intact. But Abraham Lincoln was fairly confident, very confident, in fact, that we could keep the lie of white supremacy intact, even without chattel slavery. And that's what he set out to do. He was willing to address the institution because he knew the narrative would continue to live on. In fact, I'm convinced this is why he's one of our greatest presidents. Even the left and the right have a bipartisan love for Abraham Lincoln because he found a way to keep the narrative alive, even while he got rid of this kind of black eye of the institution of chattel slavery. 13th Amendment doesn't abolish slavery, it redefines and codifies it. under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party has been duly convicted, shall exist. This is what made Abraham Lincoln one of our greatest presidents, is he found a way to keep the narrative alive, even while he removed the institution. And so slavery became Jim Crow. And then when that got addressed, that then became segregation, separate but equal. But that still was not there. It kept the narrative of white supremacy alive. And then that fell into the narrative of the new Jim Crow, or mass incarceration. So the narrative has been alive and well and healthy throughout. It's lasted through all of these versions of the system that has gone on. And it's continuing today. It's continuing even today. And this is why one of the things that I feel very strongly about is we have to address both sides of the narrative, right? Our nation actually does not address the narrative of white supremacy. We do address the narrative of racism, right? We have slogans today like Black Lives Matter, Native Lives Matter. We're trying to address the narrative of racism and of sexism. But we rarely address the other side of that narrative, the balance to that narrative, or the other component of that narrative, which is the narrative of white supremacy. We rarely will talk about that. We have this notion in our country that we have a lot of racist people and we have a few white supremacists. We have a lot of people we believe who are racist, who do negative things to people because of their race. But we think we reserve this role of white supremacists, right? These are the KKK members. These are the Breitbart editors. These are the white evangelicals who are voting blindly for Donald Trump, right? We have a smaller subset, a smaller group of people who we say are white supremacists. I would say the difference, it's actually the flip. I think the majority of Americans are white supremacists. There's a few who act out negatively towards someone who is racist, doing something negative because of their belief in white supremacy. I forget when I talked about earlier this week, I was addressing the issue of boarding schools, right? And when boarding schools were being justified by Richard Pratt, he gave a speech and he immediately, so this was in 1893. This was 3 years after the massacre at Wounded Knee. And our nation was losing its stomach for blatant genocide. They still wanted native lands, but they were losing their stomach for blatant genocide. And so they came up with this idea of killing the Indians to save the man. And as a way to disenfranchise children from their parents and culturally commit cultural genocide. And when Richard Pratt was laying this out in a speech in 1893, he immediately compared it to slavery. And I'm paraphrasing, but he said, as abhorrent as slavery was, it bestowed upon Black people the greatest blessing they've ever received, which is it brought them from savagery and cannibalism in Africa to partial citizenship, becoming civilized and English-speaking in America. And how did this happen and so quickly? Through association. By allowing them to associate with members of the higher race, i.e. their slave owners, they became civilized and English-speaking. And his argument was, if that happened out of circumstance because of enslavement, how much more quickly would it happen if we intentionally did it with boarding schools for Native peoples? This was his argument, right? And so the troubling piece about that is this is why assimilation is such a core American value. Because our nation truly believes we are exceptional. Our nation truly believes in white supremacy. It truly believes white Europeans, Christian Europeans, have a land covenant with God of Abraham. It truly believes in our moral, religious, cultural, linguistic superiority. And it says, but we can be benevolent with that. And we can just go out and begin to humanize the subhumans that we're surrounded by, allowing them to associate with us. Right? This is the problem. Most of our missions of this country are done with an air of white supremacy. Most of the charitable gifts we give are done with the air of white supremacy. We absolutely believe we are superior to the rest of the world. We're just benevolent white supremacists who are willing to impart a bit of humanity upon the subhumans around us. So I would actually argue the majority of our nation is white supremacists. And there's a smaller subgroup that are proactively racist. And we can see this because, right, we hear all the time, Black Lives Matter, Native Lives Matter. We have to help these poor groups, these poor people. We have to do all these things. And this is why on my social media, fairly regular basis, I will post and say, yes, Black Lives Matter, yes, Native Lives Matter. But we have to also do the other side of that coin, which is we have to acknowledge that white people aren't superior. Right? And this is what grates white people. You're racist. How can you say something like that? That's not a racist statement. It's just a true statement. White people are not superior. They're not. If it bothers you that I say that, you probably should check your implicit racial bias. Probably should take a look into that. See, that's the narrative that perpetuates itself. That's the narrative. The myth of American exceptionalism, the lie of white supremacy, these are the narratives that are embedded deep within our systems by the doctrine of discovery. And these are the narratives that we never really fully address. You know, I talked about this with the campaign, right? Why is American exceptionalism such a bipartisan value? Because it's one of the core narratives of our nation. If you want to be a political leader in the United States of America, the system is designed to force you to tell white people that they are superior, that they are exceptional. It forces you to do that. This is why President Obama said, when he was talking about the opposition he faced while he was in office, and he quoted the Constitution, he said, "We the people, our Constitution begins with these three simple words, words we've come to recognize now mean all the people." We've never decided that, Mr. President. And you know it's not true. It's not true. This is why we have to stop affirming American exceptionalism. This is why we state American exceptionalism is the coping mechanism for a nation that's in deep denial of its genocidal past as well as its current racist reality. That's the underlying narrative that we have to address, this myth of American exceptionalism, this lie of white supremacy. There was a section in here that I wanted to read and look at for a moment. Let me find it in the book. It's around the issue with metaphors. And I just wanted to highlight something here for you. I was taking some notes earlier. Let me find it here. One of the things, right, this issue with the narratives, and with how those perpetuate themselves, and how American exceptionalism is the coping mechanism that is affirmed, is held as a bipartisan value. When I give my lectures on the Doctrine of Discovery, one of the most powerful graphics that I show is this one right here. It's after, I use it after I talk about the history, and I've just gone through and shown how our nation literally committed genocide against Native peoples and abhorrently enacted enslavement against African people. And I've really brought the audience to a pretty heavy place. And I tell them, I say, the challenge is we don't teach a history in our country, we teach a mythology. We believe that we have a legacy of discovery. We believe in equality. We have a system of, we are exceptional. We have a history of expansion. Liberty and justice here exists for everybody. And we're a Christian nation. These are our mythologies that we perpetuate. And then I show them this slide and I say, we need to counter that myth. We need to look at how the myth is different. The myth says discovery. The history says dehumanization. The myth says equality. The history says for a select few. The myth says expansion. The history says ethnic cleansing. The myth says exceptionalism. The history says genocide. The myth says liberty and justice for all. The history says liberty and justice for white landowning men. The myth says Christian nation. The history says Christendom. And these are the narratives that we have to learn how to deconstruct. These are the narratives that we have to learn how to address as a nation. And these are the narratives that we allow to continue to multiple, or not to multiple, but to regenerate themselves and to perpetuate themselves and to get brought into new systems and new systems and new institutions, and they never fully go away. Because we only address the individuals. This was an individual who caused that problem, or it's a single system that caused that problem, and we don't address the underlying narratives, the metaphors, and the imagination that's behind it. And then just the example that makes it so clear how dangerous this diseased social system, social imagination, this diseased theological imagination, this diseased transcendent imagination is. And this quote, which I use frequently in the book and in the lectures I give, of Peter Burnett from 1851 in his State of the State address to California, that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races till the Indian race becomes extinct, must be expected. While we cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or the wisdom of man to avert. He's not saying disease is broken out and we can't stop its spread. He's not saying they're hungry and we can't feed them. He's literally saying, he's acknowledging, as they are actively completing their manifest destiny, we cannot stop this process until they become extinct. This is the danger of this diseased way of thinking, of this diseased imagination. And then through the use of metaphors and of narratives, we don't even acknowledge that this is what we did. And even when we do, and I was actually talking about this today earlier in my second cup of coffee, when I was talking about what happened this past week with the Tulsa Massacre, and how President Biden went to Tulsa and acknowledged rather bluntly that this history happened. And to heal from it, we have to acknowledge it. The problem is Joe Biden is a white landowning male from the 1% who got elected by reaffirming the myth of American exceptionalism and appealing to the status quo of white moderates from the left and the right. And so he will say things like that to appease the people of color who vote for him and support him. but then he won't address it beyond that. Right? He will still say we need to restore the soul of America. He will still say when these events happen, this is not who we are. He may put diversity on his cabinet and even in his White House, but he will not give them the voice to speak freely. Right? This is the problem. Why? Because if he allows the voices of the diverse people he put on his cabinet to speak freely, they will contradict that myth. They will begin to write a new narrative. That's very dangerous to the group of people who got Joe Biden elected. So he's walking a tightrope. Now he's getting closer to the edge than most white presidents have in any point in our history, but he's still very, very, very careful to not cross that line. He knows who got him elected. It was not people of color. It was not even progressives. Joe Biden was elected by the vote and the money of white moderates from the left and the right. That's who got him elected. That's who he appealed to. So this is the challenge that we're facing as a nation. These are the things we need to find a way to address and change if we're ever going to move forward in these things. I hope this is helpful. We've been going for about 50 to 55 minutes. Let me look through the chat to see if there are any questions in here. If people have questions, I welcome you to put them in the question. I'll put it this way. Here's an example of how you can put it in there. Just type question and then put the text of your question there. And I'll be happy to take a few moments now to answer some questions that anyone may have about this chapter. But this chapter is a very important one because not only does it help us understand this world we live in, but it actually gives us the tools of what we need to do to try to fix them or to address them. And so this chapter, you may have to read through it a few times, and we didn't expand on it in the book as much as I even just expanded on some of it here. But it's a very important chapter to understand of what, not only why is our reality the way it is, but what are the ways we need to work to address it. And this is why I work so hard to make sure I use right language, right? I don't say reconciliation, I say conciliation. I don't affirm the myth of American exceptionalism. I deconstruct the myths whenever possible. I will tell white people, you're not superior. These are all things we need to do. This is why I don't use the term white privilege. White privilege makes it sound like what white people have is a blessing they have to learn how to share. That's not true. What they have is the fruit of racial oppression, and that needs to be confronted. This is all ways to address these diseased imaginations, to address the power of these metaphors and of these narratives so that we can move this system in a different direction. Any other questions that people have here? I appreciate you joining me today. Thank you so much. If you have other questions, please feel free to put them on social media later or to put them into the comments of these posts when they go onto my social media. I would be thrilled to try to answer any more questions you may have here, but I appreciate all of you for joining me for this live stream. And I hope that you have a wonderful weekend. This weekend is actually the 23rd wedding anniversary of my wife and I. And so we are looking forward to having a time of celebration this weekend as we celebrate our 23rd year of marriage. So I may not be on social media as much over the weekend, but I will be active and online again next week as we engage in a few things, in more conversation next week. So yeah, my relatives, I hope that you have a beautiful day. I hope you have a great weekend. Walk in beauty, and may we learn how to walk in beauty together. And hakone.